The dusty town of Sweetwater seemed to hold its breath in the late afternoon heat. The main street, lined with weathered wooden buildings, was quiet except for the occasional creak of a rocking chair or the distant laughter of children. At the edge of town stood a small schoolhouse, its white paint peeling under the relentless western sun. Inside, Margaret DeLeon, Maggie to the townsfolk, was carefully arranging books on the shelves. Her delicate hands moved with precision, each movement deliberate and careful. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that had earned her respect, if not complete understanding, from the people of Sweetwater. "Miss DeLeon, I finished that arithmetic problem," young Tommy Wilson called out, his freckled face beaming with pride as he held up his slate. Maggie smiled warmly, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear as she walked over to him. "Let me see, Tommy." Her voice was soft but clear, with just the faintest hint of an accent that betrayed her Mexican heritage. As the children filed out at day's end, Maggie stood at the doorway, watching them scatter like autumn leaves in the wind. Her keen eyes, dark as midnight, surveyed the town with an attentiveness few noticed. Nothing escaped her gaze. Not the new family that had moved in last week, not the sheriff riding out that morning on business, and certainly not the two rough-looking men who had just ridden into town. Their horses were dusty from the trail, but the men's weapons gleamed with careful maintenance. The taller one, lean as a whip with a scar cutting across his left cheek, scanned the street with predatory eyes. His companion, stockier and sporting a red bandana, spat tobacco juice onto the ground as they passed the schoolhouse. "Well, looky here," the scarred man drawled, noticing Maggie. "Sweetwater's got itself a pretty little school marm." "Clayton," the other man said with a chuckle, "reckon she's teaching them young'uns how to curtsy and sip tea?" Clayton Rourke and Jesse Vance. Maggie had heard the names whispered with fear in nearby towns. Bank robbers, killers, men who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. "Good evening, gentlemen," Maggie replied evenly, her posture straight as a ruler. "If you're looking for the sheriff, I'm afraid he's out of town today." Clayton's eyes narrowed, then he laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "Ain't that convenient? We just might have to stay a while then." As they rode on, Maggie's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the doorframe. Behind her calm exterior, an old instinct stirred, one she had buried years ago on blood-soaked battlefields. If you think a quiet schoolteacher is the last person these bandits should cross, wait until you see what happens next. Where are you watching from today? And have you ever misjudged someone who turned out to be much more than they appeared? The sun dipped below the horizon, painting Sweetwater in shades of amber and gold. Maggie tidied her classroom, her movements methodical, unhurried. Through the window, she could see Clayton and Jesse sauntering toward the general store, their spurs jingling with each confident step. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her face remained impassive. Inside Calloway's general store, Mr. Calloway was helping Mrs. Peterson select flour when the bell above the door jangled. The storekeeper looked up, his welcoming smile faltering as Clayton and Jesse stepped inside. "Evening, folks," Clayton announced, removing his hat with mock politeness. "Fine establishment you got here." Mr. Calloway, a balding man in his 50s, nodded cautiously. "Thank you. Can I help you gentlemen find something?" Jesse chuckled, running his finger along a shelf of canned goods. "Oh, I reckon you can help us with quite a bit." In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver, pointing it casually at Calloway's chest. "Starting with whatever's in that cash box of yours." Mrs. Peterson gasped, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Calloway raised his hands slowly, his face pale beneath his mustache. "Now there's no need for that," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't keep much cash on hand." Clayton moved behind the counter, shoving Calloway aside. "We'll be the judge of what's much, old man." He found the cash box and whistled as he opened it. "Looky here, Jesse. Seems like business is good in Sweetwater." Outside, Maggie had finished locking the schoolhouse and was walking home when she noticed the commotion. Several townspeople stood in the street, watching the general store with anxious expressions. She approached quietly, her steps measured. "What's happening?" she asked Tom Miller, the blacksmith. "Those newcomers," Tom whispered back. "They've pulled guns on Calloway. The sheriff's not due back till tomorrow. Nobody knows what to do." Maggie's gaze swept over the gathered townspeople, hard-working men and women who had built lives here, who deserved peace. Then she looked at the store, calculating angles, distances, possibilities. "Has anyone been hurt?" she asked, her voice steady. Tom shook his head. "Not yet, but they don't seem the type to leave witnesses." Inside, Clayton was stuffing bills into his pockets while Jesse kept his gun trained on the 3 customers who'd had the misfortune to be shopping. "Anybody moves, they get a bullet," Jesse warned, his eyes gleaming with enjoyment. "This is going really smoothly. Might just have to visit the saloon next." The door opened. Every head turned as Maggie stepped inside, looking for all the world like she was simply coming to buy a spool of thread. "Well now," Clayton sneered. "The schoolmarm's come to join our little party." Maggie closed the door behind her. "I think you gentlemen have overstayed your welcome in our town." Jesse's harsh laugh filled the store. "You hear that, Clayton? The little lady thinks we should leave." He pointed his gun at her, but Maggie didn't flinch. "What are you gonna do, miss? Teach us our letters?" Clayton circled from behind the counter, studying her with amused interest. "Maybe she's gonna give us a stern talking to about our manners." The bandits had no idea that the woman standing before them had once been known by another name, a name whispered with fear in military camps on both sides of the Rio Grande. They couldn't see that behind her calm exterior, Maggie was already mapping out every possible move, every escape route, every weapon within reach. "I'm giving you one chance," she said quietly. "Return what you've taken and ride out." Clayton's smile widened as he approached her, stopping just inches away. He could smell lavender soap and see the fine fabric of her high-collared dress. "And if we don't?" Maggie's dark eyes met his, unflinching. "Then I'll be forced to teach you a different kind of lesson." The standoff in Calloway's store hung suspended in tense silence. To the bandits, Maggie's threat seemed laughable, a delicate schoolteacher against armed outlaws. But behind her composed exterior lay memories of another life, one forged in the chaos of war. 20 years earlier, along the rugged terrain of the Mexican border, 14-year-old Magdalena DeLeon had watched American troops approach her village. Her father, Ricardo DeLeon, was no ordinary man. He was a master marksman, revered among the Mexican resistance fighters for his uncanny ability to hit targets at distances that seemed impossible. "Watch closely, Magdalena," he had whispered as they lay hidden among the rocks. "The rifle is merely an extension of your eye, your breath, your patience." His weathered hands guided hers on the long-barreled rifle, teaching her to account for wind, distance, and the earth's pull. Guerrilla fighters twice her age sought her guidance. Mexican generals requested her services for critical missions. The Americans placed a bounty on her head, never imagining their elusive adversary was barely more than a child. During the final year of war, she had tallied over 60 confirmed kills. Officers, scouts, supply line leaders. She struck with such precision that superstitious soldiers claimed she could bend bullets around corners or shoot through solid rock. But war changes even the strongest hearts. After witnessing too much bloodshed, after seeing her skills exploit too many final breaths, Magdalena laid down her rifle when peace was declared. She crossed the border legally years later, simplified her name to Margaret, and dedicated herself to building rather than taking lives. She became a teacher, creating a new identity far from the battlefields that had shaped her youth. Now, facing Clayton and Jesse in the general store, those buried instincts resurfaced with startling clarity. She noted Clayton's gun hung in a cross-draw holster. He'd be slower on the uptake. Jesse's stance revealed an old injury to his right leg. He'd favor his left when moving quickly. The distance to the counter, the angle of the afternoon light through the windows, the presence of innocence in potential lines of fire, all registered in her mind within seconds. "I think the lady's trying to scare us," Jessie laughed, nudging Clayton. "Ain't that sweet?" Clayton smirked, leaning closer to Maggie. "Listen, darling, why don't you run back to your schoolhouse? Grown folks are conducting business here." "I've given you your warning," Maggie replied, her voice soft but clear. Her accent, usually carefully concealed, slipped through slightly. "What happens next is your choice." Clayton's eyes narrowed, detecting something unexpected in her tone. Not fear, not panic, but a calm certainty that momentarily gave him pause. "You're threatening us?" he asked, his hand drifting toward his holster. Maggie's eyes tracked the movement, her body still as stone. "No, senor. I'm educating you." Clayton recovered from his momentary uncertainty with a booming laugh that filled the cramped store. He turned to the gathered townspeople, gesturing toward Maggie with exaggerated movements. "You hear that, Jessie? The schoolmarm's gonna educate us." His mockery drew a snicker from his partner, who kept his gun trained on Mr. Calloway. "And just what lesson might you be teaching today, Miss DeLeon?" Maggie remained perfectly still, a center of calm amid the tension. "Consequences," she replied simply. The single word hung in the air, carrying more weight than its syllables should allow. For the briefest moment, an expression of unease flickered across Jessie's face before he masked it with another laugh. "Well then," Clayton said, turning back to the storekeeper, "let's continue our education. Mr. Calloway, I believe you have some fine tobacco behind that counter, and perhaps a bottle of your best whiskey, too." Calloway hesitated, glancing toward Maggie as if seeking direction. Seeing no signal from her, he reluctantly reached for the items. "That's it," Clayton crooned. "Nice and easy." He stuffed the goods into his saddlebag, then sauntered around the store, plucking items off shelves as though shopping on a pleasant afternoon. "Jessie, we should take some candy for later. I do have a sweet tooth." Jessie grinned, keeping his gun steady. "Don't forget some ribbons for the ladies we might meet in the next town." The bandits continued their methodical humiliation of the town, forcing Mrs. Peterson to wrap their stolen goods, making young Peter Williams carry their bags, all while keeping Maggie in their peripheral vision. The schoolteacher hadn't moved, hadn't spoken another word. Her stillness began to unnerve them, though neither would admit it. Finally, their arms laden with spoils, Clayton approached Maggie again. "Well, Miss DeLeon, looks like school's out for today. Unless you have something else to teach us?" Maggie's gaze was level, her voice measured. "You've had your fun. Time to leave." Clayton leaned in closer, his breath hot against her face. "And if we don't, what will you do then, Miss DeLeon?" A muscle tightened almost imperceptibly in Maggie's jaw. "I'd prefer not to demonstrate." Something in her tone, a steel edge beneath the velvet, made Clayton step back, suddenly aware that the schoolteacher hadn't shown a single sign of fear. It bothered him. Everyone feared them. That was the natural order of things. "Tell you what," Jessie called out, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Let's see if the teacher can shoot. Clayton, you still got that empty bottle?" Clayton's mood brightened at the prospect of further entertainment. "Sure do." He pulled a whiskey bottle from his saddlebag, drained the last drops, and held it up. "What do you say, Miss DeLeon? Care to show us your skills?" The townspeople exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew Miss DeLeon as refined, gentle. Surely she'd never held a firearm. "I don't engage in pointless displays," Maggie replied. "Afraid?" Clayton taunted, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "Or just know your place." The schoolteacher's eyes hardened. She extended her hand. "Your revolver, please." Clayton blinked in surprise, then burst into fresh laughter. "Now I've heard everything." Still chuckling, he handed her his gun, certain she wouldn't know how to hold it properly. "Throw the bottle," Maggie instructed, her tone making it clear she wouldn't repeat herself. Jessie shrugged and tossed the bottle high into the air. Before it reached the apex of its arc, Maggie's arm extended, her finger squeezed the trigger, and the bottle exploded into glistening shards. The laughter died in Clayton's throat. The shards of glass hadn't even hit the ground before whispers rippled through the stunned onlookers. Mr. Calloway's mouth hung open in disbelief. Mrs. Peterson clutched her chest, eyes wide with shock. No one in Sweetwater had ever seen Miss DeLeon so much as hold a gun, let alone shoot with such deadly precision. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Jesse demanded, his previous mockery replaced by wary respect. Maggie handed Clayton's revolver back to him, grip first. Her movements were fluid, practiced, the motions of someone who had handled firearms all her life. "I had a good teacher," she said simply. Clayton took his gun, studying Maggie with new eyes. The schoolteacher's demeanor hadn't changed, still composed, still dignified, but something had shifted in the air around her. The bandits' advantage was slipping away, and they knew it. "Lucky shot," Clayton muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Maggie's expression remained unchanged. "If that's what you need to believe." She turned her attention to the townspeople, speaking with quiet authority. "Mr. Calloway, please take Mrs. Peterson and the others to safety. These men were just leaving." "Now hold on," Clayton growled, his pride stinging from the sudden reversal. His hand hovered near his holster. "Nobody tells us when to leave. Maybe that was a fluke. I think we need a proper demonstration." Maggie sighed, a teacher disappointed by a slow student. "I don't fight fools," she said, turning her back on him, the ultimate dismissal. It was a calculated risk. She knew men like Clayton couldn't tolerate such disrespect, especially from a woman. As she took 3 measured steps toward the door, she counted silently in her head. 1, 2, 3. Behind her, Clayton's face flushed dark with rage. "Why, you uppity!" His hand flew to his holster. Maggie pivoted with startling speed. Her arm extended in one smooth motion as she drew a small derringer from a hidden pocket in her skirt. The shot rang out with surprising force from such a tiny weapon. Clayton howled in pain as his revolver spun from his grip. A perfect shot, having struck the weapon itself without grazing his flesh. Jesse stared in disbelief, frozen in place, his own gun half raised. "That," Maggie said into the ringing silence, "was intentional restraint." Her eyes, no longer those of a gentle schoolteacher, fixed on Clayton with the cold focus of a predator. "The next one won't be." The general store had fallen so silent that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like thunder. Clayton cradled his stinging hand, his face contorted in a mixture of pain, rage, and disbelief. Blood trickled from where the revolver's hammer had cut his palm as it was shot away. "You made a grave mistake," Maggie said, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "But I'm offering you a second chance. Take your friend, leave town, and never return." Jesse had recovered enough to find his voice. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. For the first time, Maggie allowed a flicker of her true self to show, the shadow of La Dama de la Muerte passing briefly across her features. "Someone who's killed better men than you for lesser offenses." The words hung in the air, carrying the unmistakable weight of truth. Even the townspeople felt a chill, suddenly seeing their beloved teacher in a different light. "This is my town," Maggie continued, meeting Clayton's furious gaze without flinching. "These are my people. I've made my peace with violence, but make no mistake, I will return to it if necessary." Her accent, normally almost imperceptible, became more pronounced as emotion colored her words. "Do not test me again." Jesse moved slowly to help Clayton up, his eyes darting between Maggie and the exit. The smaller derringer remained steady in her hand. Everyone in the room understood that despite its size, in Maggie's hand it was as deadly as any weapon they'd ever seen. "Let's go, Clayton," Jesse muttered. "Not worth it." Pride warred with survival instinct on Clayton's face. Finally, with a venomous glare, he spat on the floor. "This ain't over, schoolmarm." "For your sake, it should be," Maggie replied evenly. The bandits backed toward the door, Jesse keeping his arm around Clayton's shoulders. The storekeeper and customers pressed themselves against the walls, giving the outlaws a wide berth. As they reached the doorway, Clayton turned for one final threat. "Nobody makes a fool of Clayton Rourke. I'll be back, and you'll wish you'd never crossed me." Maggie didn't respond, didn't need to. The look in her eyes, the calm certainty of someone who had faced death many times and delivered it even more, spoke volumes. The bandits mounted their horses, Clayton awkwardly with his injured hand. As they galloped out of town, dust billowing behind them, Maggie watched from the store's threshold, the derringer now hidden once more in the folds of her skirt. She knew men like Clayton. Wounded pride was more dangerous than a wounded body. He wouldn't leave things be. 3 days passed with no sign of Clayton or Jesse. The incident at the general store had transformed Sweetwater's perception of their schoolteacher. Some parents kept their distance, uncertain about having their children taught by a woman with such deadly skills. Others regarded her with newfound respect, even awe. The children, sensing the change but not understanding it, whispered exciting theories about Miss DeLeon being a secret agent or a princess in disguise. Maggie carried on with her duties as if nothing had changed. She taught arithmetic and geography, corrected essays, and led singing practice with the same gentle patience as always. But at night, alone in her small house at the edge of town, she prepared. She retrieved a weathered leather case from beneath the floorboards under her bed. Inside lay a disassembled Whitworth rifle, a rare precision weapon she had taken from a Confederate sharpshooter during the war. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency as she cleaned each part, assembled the rifle, and checked its sights. The familiar weight of it brought back memories she had tried to bury, the smell of gunpowder, the copper taste of fear, the weight of lives ended by her hand. Sheriff Dawson had returned to town and heard the story from a dozen excited witnesses. He'd visited Maggie that evening, hat in hand, awkwardness evident in his stance. "Never would have figured you for a shooter, Miss DeLeon," he'd said, unable to reconcile the refined schoolteacher with the marksman described. Maggie had simply nodded. "There are many things we don't know about each other, Sheriff." The door hinges gave a telltale creak as someone slowly pushed it open. Maggie didn't turn around, didn't give any indication she'd heard. Instead, she calmly dipped her pen in ink and continued marking a student's essay. "I know you're there," she said clearly, still not turning. "And I know you're not alone." A soft curse broke the silence, Clayton's voice recognizable even in a whisper. Without warning, Maggie spun in her chair, rifle already positioned at her shoulder. She fired a single shot that splintered the door frame, mere inches from where a shadow was visible. "That was a warning!" she called out, as Boots scuffled frantically outside. "The next one removes your ability to run away!" She heard rapid footsteps retreating, followed by the sound of horses galloping away. Maggie exhaled slowly, her fingers still resting lightly on the trigger. They would be back, and with more men. Tonight had been reconnaissance, testing her vigilance. The real attack was yet to come. Sweetwater held its breath in the pre-dawn hours. Maggie hadn't returned to her small house after the incident at the schoolhouse, instead positioning herself strategically on the roof of the livery stable that offered a clear view of all approaches to town. The Whitworth rifle rested comfortably against her shoulder, its familiar weight a grim reminder of the life she had once led. Sheriff Dawson had organized a small group of townsmen to stand guard at various points, but Maggie knew they were not fighters. Their presence was more symbolic than practical. Decent men standing for their town, even if they lacked the skills for what was coming. The first pale light of dawn had just begun to streak the eastern sky when Maggie spotted them. 6 riders approaching slowly from the south, keeping to the shadows of the cottonwoods that lined the creek bed. Clayton and Jesse had indeed brought reinforcements. Through the rifle's scope, she could make out Clayton's distinctive slouch in the saddle, his injured hand still bandaged. Jesse rode beside him with 4 rough-looking men spread out behind them. She recognized their type immediately, hired guns, probably promised a share of whatever they could loot from the town. Maggie took a slow, deep breath, clearing her mind of everything except the task at hand. The schoolteacher faded away, and the sharpshooter emerged, calculating wind, distance, and the movement of her targets with practiced precision. The riders separated as they reached town, 2 circling toward the general store, 2 heading for the saloon, and Clayton and Jesse moving directly toward the schoolhouse, likely expecting to find Maggie there. She waited until they were fully committed to their positions before taking action. The rifle cracked once, and the hat flew off one of the hired guns. The man froze, then frantically scanned the buildings, unable to determine where the shot had come from. Before they could regroup, Maggie fired again. This time, her bullet found the shoulder of the man approaching the general store. He howled in pain, clutching his arm as he tumbled from his horse. "That's her!" Clayton shouted, pointing wildly toward the livery stable. "The schoolmarm's up there!" The remaining men turned their horses, drawing their weapons. Maggie's third shot struck a rifle from a gunman's hands, the impact sending him reeling in his saddle. Panic spread among the hired guns, who had been told they were facing a solitary schoolteacher, not a precision marksman who could hit targets at impossible distances without exposing herself to return fire. "This ain't what you promised, Clayton," one of them shouted, wheeling his horse around. "You said this would be easy pickings." A fourth shot kicked up dust directly in front of the retreating rider's horse, causing it to rear in terror. "The next one isn't a warning," Maggie's voice rang out across the street, clear and commanding. "Throw down your weapons or die where you stand." 2 of the hired guns immediately tossed their weapons to the ground, raising their hands high. They'd faced lawmen and rival outlaws before, but there was something unnatural about a shooter who could place bullets with such precision from an obscured position. One of them wheeled his horse around and galloped away without a backward glance, abandoning Clayton's cause completely. Jesse hesitated, looking to Clayton for direction. His loyalty warred with his survival instinct as another shot from Maggie's rifle splintered a hitching post mere inches from his leg. "Damn you, Clayton," he finally spat. "You never said nothing about facing no ghost shooter." He dropped his gun and raised his hands. "I ain't dying today, not for you." Clayton Rourke sat alone on his horse now, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. His remaining men had surrendered or fled, and Jesse, his partner through years of robbery and murder, had abandoned him. But pride kept him in his saddle, hand hovering near his replacement revolver. Maggie emerged from the stable, rifle held confidently at her side as she walked down the middle of the street. The golden light of dawn illuminated her figure. Not the schoolmarm now, but the warrior she had once been. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, her posture straight as a blade. "It's over, Clayton," she called, stopping 30 paces from him. "You have a choice to make." "Ain't no school teacher gonna run me off," he snarled, though his voice trembled slightly. "You think you're something special with that rifle? At this distance, I could put a bullet in you before you raised it." Maggie set her rifle down deliberately, leaning it against a water trough. Gasps arose from the townspeople who had gathered at a safe distance to watch. She was now unarmed, facing an outlaw known for his ruthlessness. "Perhaps," she agreed calmly, "but you won't." Clayton's hand inched closer to his holster. "And why's that?" "Because you know what I am now," Maggie replied. "You've seen what I can do. And deep down, beneath all that bravado, you're afraid." His face flushed dark with anger. "I ain't afraid of no woman." "Not just a woman," Maggie said, taking a step closer. "La Dama de la Muerte, the Lady of Death. I've killed more men than you've robbed, Clayton Rourke. I've ended the lives of soldiers, officers, men trained for war, not frightened shopkeepers and farmers." Recognition flickered in Clayton's eyes. The name was legendary among those who had fought or followed the Mexican-American War. Many believed La Dama was just a myth, a ghost story to explain the uncanny accuracy of Mexican snipers. "You have one last choice," Maggie continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent street. "Ride away now, leave this territory forever, or be buried here by sundown." Clayton's hand trembled, caught between reaching for his gun and gripping his reins. Finally, his shoulders slumped. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode slowly out of town, his back rigid with wounded pride, but his will to fight broken forever. The dust from Clayton's departure had barely settled when Sheriff Dawson approached Maggie, his expression a mixture of awe and uncertainty. The morning sun now fully illuminated the main street of Sweetwater, casting long shadows behind the gathered townspeople who stood in stunned silence, struggling to reconcile the genteel schoolteacher they'd known with the deadly sharpshooter they'd just witnessed. Maggie nodded slightly, her posture gradually softening as she retrieved her rifle. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, the warrior receding, the schoolteacher returning. "I did what was necessary, Sheriff. Nothing more." Mrs. Calloway pushed through the crowd, her normally timid demeanor replaced by determined gratitude. "You saved my Thomas's life," she said, reaching for Maggie's hand. "You saved all of us." One by one, the townspeople came forward, some with thanks, others with questions they couldn't quite articulate. Maggie answered what she could, deflected what she wouldn't, but stood her ground with quiet dignity. Mr. Peterson, the town's most prominent businessman, watched from the edge of the gathering, his shrewd eyes calculating. "The school board will have questions," he muttered to Dawson. "Can we really have someone with her background teaching our children?" The sheriff snorted. "After what she just did? I'd say we're lucky to have her." By midday, Sweetwater had split into factions. Some, like the Calloways and the blacksmith's family, defended Maggie fiercely. Others kept their distance, eyeing her with newfound wariness when she walked to the schoolhouse that afternoon. Inside the classroom, Maggie found her students waiting, their young faces alive with excitement and questions. "Miss DeLeon, is it true you shot the bad men?" Tommy Wilson blurted before she could speak. "Did you really learn to shoot in a war?" little Sarah Jenkins added. Maggie set her books down carefully. "Children," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "there are times when people must stand up to those who would do harm. Today was one of those times." "Are you still our teacher?" Annie Calloway asked, her voice small with worry. Maggie's expression softened. "Of course I am. That hasn't changed." But everything else had. As she led the children through their arithmetic lessons, Maggie could see the town reshaping itself through the schoolhouse windows. People gathered in small clusters, talking animatedly. Some glanced toward the school with expressions ranging from admiration to suspicion. By evening, when she locked the schoolhouse door, Maggie knew that Sweetwater would never see her the same way again. The carefully constructed identity she had built over years had been fractured, revealing glimpses of her true self. Yet as she walked home under a sky painted with sunset colors, Maggie felt something unexpected: relief. After years of hiding, of burying her past, there was an odd freedom in being seen, even partially, for who she truly was. In the weeks that followed, stories of the schoolmarm sharpshooter spread across the frontier like wildfire. Stagecoach passengers arriving in Sweetwater would crane their necks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary teacher. Young girls who had once dreamed only of marriage now whispered of learning to shoot, standing up for themselves, being brave like Miss DeLeon. Sheriff Dawson found himself repeating the tale to every lawman who passed through, each telling growing slightly more elaborate. "Should have seen it," he'd say, leaning back in his chair. "6 outlaws, all armed to the teeth, and she picked them off like they were tin cans on a fence post. Remind me to never leave town again when trouble's brewing." The school board had convened an emergency meeting the day after the incident, with Mr. Peterson loudly arguing that someone with Maggie's violent past shouldn't be teaching impressionable children. But when 12-year-old Annie Calloway stood up at the meeting and declared that she was proud to learn from someone who protected others, the arguments lost steam. The board voted unanimously to keep Maggie as teacher, though they did ask her to refrain from bringing firearms onto school property. For her part, Maggie neither confirmed nor denied the growing legends about her past. She continued teaching with the same dedication, adding subtle lessons about courage, justice, and standing up for what was right. "Miss DeLeon," Tommy asked one afternoon as they studied American history, "is it true that you killed 50 men during the war?" The classroom fell silent. Maggie carefully set down her chalk and turned to face her students. "War is not something to glorify, Tommy," she said quietly. "Taking a life, any life, leaves a mark on your soul that never fades. Remember that." After class, Mary Fletcher, a shy girl who rarely spoke, lingered behind. "Miss DeLeon," she whispered, "my pa says women aren't supposed to be strong like men, but you're strong, and you're still a lady." Maggie knelt to meet the girl's eyes. "Strength comes in many forms, Mary. Sometimes it's standing up to danger. Sometimes it's having the courage to be kind when others are cruel. But never let anyone tell you that you can't be both strong and a woman. Those aren't opposite things." As summer turned to fall, Sweetwater settled into a new normal. Maggie's past became an accepted part of the town's fabric, neither constantly discussed nor entirely forgotten. The children flourished under her teaching, perhaps more than ever now that she could openly incorporate lessons about resilience and courage drawn from her own experiences. And if Maggie sometimes climbed to the roof of her small house late at night to scan the horizon with watchful eyes, no one mentioned it. Some habits, forged in war and honed by necessity, never truly fade. 15 years passed in Sweetwater, the town growing from a dusty outpost to a respectable settlement with a proper brick schoolhouse, a town hall, and even a small library that Maggie had fought tirelessly to establish. Her hair now showed strands of silver, elegant against the black. But her posture remained as straight as ever, her dark eyes just as sharp. Most of the children she had taught during the Clayton Rourke incident were grown with families of their own. Tommy Wilson had become the town's doctor. Annie Calloway ran the general store after her father's passing. Many of them still called her Miss DeLeon, despite her insistence that they were adults now. The story of the schoolmarm sharpshooter had become local legend, embellished with each telling, until some versions claimed she had single-handedly fought off 20 outlaws without so much as a hair falling out of place. Maggie would smile and shake her head whenever she overheard these exaggerations, but never corrected them. The Whitworth rifle remained beneath her floorboards, cleaned regularly but unused for years. Until one sweltering summer day, when 5 riders wearing dusty trail clothes and grim expressions rode into Sweetwater. They hitched their horses outside the saloon, spurs jangling ominously as they shouldered through the bat-wing doors. "Heard tell this town's got some special attraction," the leader said loudly, his voice carrying across the street to where Maggie stood arranging books in the library window. "Some old woman who runs the schoolhouse. Folks say she was quite the shooter back in her day." Maggie stilled, her hand resting on a leather-bound copy of Great Expectations as she listened. "You believe that nonsense, boss?" another man laughed. "Probably just talk to keep folks away." "Only one way to find out," the leader replied. "Let's pay this schoolmarm a visit after we've had a drink." Maggie calmly excused herself from the library, walking unhurriedly to her small house at the edge of town. 15 minutes later, she was in position on the bell tower of the new church. The Whitworth assembled and loaded, its brass fittings gleaming in the sunlight. When the outlaws emerged from the saloon and mounted their horses, Maggie took careful aim. The leader's hat suddenly flew from his head, a neat hole punched through its crown. Before he could react, a second shot kicked up dust between his horse's front hooves. "Jesus Christ!" one of the men shouted, looking wildly around. "Where's it coming from?" The leader, his face pale beneath his trail dust, leaned close to his companions. "Let's ride on, boys," he muttered, his bravado evaporating. "I ain't dying over some school teacher." As they galloped away, Maggie disassembled her rifle with practiced movements. Some would call it luck that trouble found Sweetwater the day she happened to be watching. But Maggie DeLeon didn't believe in luck. She believed in vigilance, in preparation, in never forgetting who you truly were beneath the identity you showed the world. The legend of the schoolmarm sharpshooter would live on, not just in Sweetwater, but across the frontier. A reminder that strength often comes from the most unexpected sources. and that some battles are fought not with armies, but with the unyielding courage of a single extraordinary soul. If you thought this was incredible, you won't want to miss what happens in this next story.